mentally ill with brown hair. Messy room clothes.
Hey, what's up? I'm Jay Moss, and today we're going to talk about how I mastered a song that went viral on TikTok. It's already at 5.3 million views. It's by an artist named Aryia, and the song is called She Don't Like Boys. It's super catchy, it's super fun, and I'm gonna show you exactly what I did to make this song a total banger. Full disclosure, it was tracked here in the studio and produced by the great Nick Cates, and I had the honor and pleasure of mastering this. There's some tricks in this that I haven't shown people before, so stick around on this one because there's a couple like cool things that like you might be like, ooh, that's good, I'm gonna steal that. I'm gonna steal Jay's tricks. Let's go. All right, let's take a look. You can see I've got two versions of this song here. I just wanted to show everybody this version. So this is the mix file that I was given. It's really well done. It's a good gain staging, and this is how it came in. I turned it into this, and I'll show you why. The first trick I'm gonna show you has to do with managing your high end very effectively. So we can say goodbye to this guy for a second, and I wanna show you this. So each section represents a different symbol on the drums being played. Or more consequentially, or more importantly, the symbol being played in these ones with this little icon up here, these are the ones that were played on the hi-hats. So a lot of us rock producers and engineers, and even anytime you're recording like real drums and it has to stand up against like a heavy, dense composition, one thing that can be a huge PITA is the hi-hats being the brightest thing in the drums, right? I think it probably has something to do with metal hitting on metal, particularly when they're open. It's just bright. It's bright in the ride, it's bright in the crash. And so for this reason, a lot of times when I'm doing masters, I'll actually break out the sections that have hi-hat, and then I'm gonna treat them a little bit differently with a low pass filter so that we can keep the high end of the master overall really, really well balanced. All right, so check this out. We'll go from a non-hi-hat part to a hi-hat part.
When's your birthday? What's your sign?
Cool, and just like that, we have our high end, much better balance. So now we can start treating things like we would in a traditional master, where we're gonna be affecting just the stereo output of the mix as sort of like one thing. So one thing I noticed with this mix, and while I do really like the drum sound, I thought the snare could sound a little bit more finished, for lack of a better term. So for that, I reached for the old faithful API 2500, and I use some of my favorite settings on this. I keep the tone on loud. This tucks the snare in and it darkens the top of the snare. My attack is really fast. I have a really small ratio because we're doing this on stereo mix bus as opposed to doing this on like just the drum bus. If I was doing this on just the drum bus, then maybe, yeah, I'd go 3/4, I'd audition those things. But because we're gonna be affecting the entire mix while at the same time trying to tame that top end crack of the snare, we're gonna keep our ratio pretty low. Our release is gonna be set to automatic because that's usually best for program material. So let me bypass this and see if you can listen for what I'm hearing in the snare. Here's before the API. Listen, I know it's very subtle, but it's the difference from like to like, it's so dumb, I know. But do you hear like it sinks in just a little bit, it darkens up just a little bit, it's starting to feel a little bit more finished, and a lot of the things we're gonna do from this point on are just gonna sort of compound on top of that. With mastering, you're gonna find like it's a lot of little but good decisions that add up to make a great product. Okay, speaking of subtle, the next thing I did is I used a de-esser. I really like everything FabFilter makes. So this is the FabFilter Pro DS, and they've got a preset, honestly, and just vocal de-essing in music. I use it all the time, and you just set your threshold to grab the S's. One thing I'm a huge proponent of when doing audio in general is I like to correct before I embellish. So what I did with the snare was I corrected sort of like the top shape of it, and what I'm doing now is I'm taking out some of this like harsh S sounds and harder transient sounds just to soften things so that when I do embellish, I don't have like all of these like errant harshnesses poking through in the mix. All right, let's loop this passage, and I'll show you how this threshold thing works. So you see I'm getting some of the top snares and the S sounds? That's great, that's what I want. Again, I told you, these are subtle changes, but they're gonna start getting bigger and bigger as we go. All right, so next up we have Ozone. Ozone's cool because it is actually just a mastering plugin in of itself. And if you wanted to do an entire master in Ozone, you could. I don't typically, but I still think it's an awesome piece of software, and I use it frequently enough. I wouldn't say every master, but I do use it for specific things that I like a lot. One thing I really like with Ozone is tucking the snare in pretty transparently. So you'll see here my EQ, I've got a little bit of like the sweetness down super low, more on that later. And up here, I have some sweetness up in the super high, also more on that later. I do more of this with a different plugin, but these are sort of like the expensive frequencies, for lack of a better word. Dynamics, I'm gonna control the low end. So let's talk about this for a second. So you'll see a couple instances of me controlling the low end in this manner in this master. So as a general rule, low frequencies are very non-directional. That's why you can kind of put like the subwoofer anywhere in your living room and it still sounds good. So on the opposite side of the frequency spectrum, the opposite is true. These frequencies are very, very directional. That's why our tweeters need to be sort of pointed at our ears to get that sense of space. And they're a little bit more free to be more dynamic than low frequencies. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna start my journey on taking that low end and making it strong but tight. So as you can see all the way up here to 132 Hertz, I've sectioned this off and you'll see this pump with a low end. And it's just a little bit of bounce, but like I said, we do things in small increments. Also, I found a few select areas where I feel like we could dynamically tuck things that we had a little bit of extra surplus in. This again creates better balance and kind of ducks our snare in a couple spots, but it does it very transparently. And I have a very, very subtle dynamic low pass filter. It's more of a low shelf here. That's just for, again, air and high frequencies. I'm still sort of smoothing. We're not quite embellishing yet. I would say there's just a touch of embellishing here, but overall we're still correcting. And then I'm using this maximizer, not as a final limiter, but I'm just using this to duck the snare just a little bit more. Like I said, tiny, tiny increments. Okay, and in the spirit of correcting high frequency harmonic issues, we're gonna use Soothe. Obviously I'm incapable of doing a video without using Soothe, so you know I love it, just have it at that. But it's really, really important, and we're gonna use Soothe in a very sharp manner, and that is to say that the notches that we're creating are gonna be really, really tight. They're gonna basically almost identically represent what frequencies are going on. One thing I really love Soothe for, I love it for a lot of things, but one thing I really like it for, might be my favorite thing, is I like lowering peak harmonics to average frequencies, especially in high mid-range and high end. Imagine we want to embellish like this curve. We want to like bring all this life to the high end, but then we have these like spinies that are poking out. And if we were just to lift the high end, we would be lifting the spinies at the same ratio, or you call it like peak harmonic frequencies, but they become fatiguing to the ear. So what we're going to do is we're going to tastefully lower that ratio by taking the harmonics that are sticking out and just gently tucking them back in so we get a smoother overall curve, and then we can embellish that. All right, so let's check out these settings. Obviously we're on a master, so we're going 4X, we're going Ultra. It's heavy on the CPU, but if your computer can handle it, you should do it. They also have this cool feature where you can just set it so it only does it when you bounce. So if you don't have like the machine for it, just do that. But when you're mastering, please use those settings. I went really sharp as advertised, and then you just sort of blend in the depth. This will be a quick A and B, but I think it's pretty illuminating. Cool thing is this is sort of doing a bit of de-essing too, but it's really these big harmonics that we're taking out that I think are the real winners here. So let's bypass and try to focus on the upper mid-range when you listen to this. Cool, so that sounds a lot smoother, a lot soother. Sorry, dad. I'm a dad, so I can. We're gonna start embellishing stuff now. If you thought Soothe was sort of hard to hear and you almost liked it better without it. That's not surprising because Soothe would be making the composition a little bit quieter, and typically our ears, we just gravitate towards louder or better. So we have to be careful with that. But it is definitely much more pleasing in the upper mid-range and the high end now. So now that we've done that, let's make it really bright and pro and cool. All right, so we're gonna use the Moog EQ4. This is my favorite plugin right now for doing what I'm about to do. It's not just because it's spelled like my name, but it doesn't hurt. So I basically use 3 knobs total on this plugin. I use the sub knob, love this knob, and then I use these 2. Sometimes I go all the way up to 40K, which is like basically dog whistle frequencies. Humans can't hear them, but they still brighten up your mix in a way that is able to be perceived. And then sometimes I go 20K if I want to be able to hear it better. You know what, actually, let's make this part of the video about 2 plugins. So we're gonna, yes, embellish both the super low end and the super high end with the Moog EQ4, but I'm also gonna bring in FabFilter Pro MB because I wanna control those low frequencies. And I want you guys to see how, like, when I push this sub stuff into the mix, how, again, we talked about this earlier in the video, we want it to be tight. So as these frequencies are turning in, there's a compressor there that's making sure the kick drum doesn't go crazy. So anyway, it'll be much easier for me to show you here, but this is a really cool and important trick. Remember, low end, tight. Okay, so I'm actually going to bypass Moog for a second. What I usually do is I just try to figure out where the kick drum is.
Fine. She's like, when's your birthday? What's
And we can see here, the only thing that's really making these sub frequencies dip is the kick. We can solo it here and check it out.
I'm picking.
Cool, sounds like we're outside the club. So now I added this. I added 2 dB of the sub frequency down here, and I added 5 dB of this 40K. This is really important because adding this sub could make that kick go crazy. So this is sort of like our catch for that. We're adding more sub and like bigness overall, but we're not letting the dynamics of our low end get wild.
Fine. She's like, when's your birthday? What's your sign? I'm picking up some Cancer vibes.
And I'm using specifically a part with a hi-hat because hi-hat, like we said, is like the brightest thing in the mix. So if I'm going to be boosting this air band, I want to make sure that the hi-hat just doesn't get wacky on me.
Fine. She's like, when's your birthday? What's your sign?
All right, we're getting there, not much left. So I really, really like this next trick. This is the trick I don't think I've ever shown anyone. We're going to very specifically just boost the sides of the mix, and we're gonna add some harmonic generation to thicken the mix. I'm gonna use a plugin called BLXL2. Weird one. It's potentially could be used as a mastering limiter with some tricks. I don't use it as a mastering limiter typically, but in situations like this where I felt like I wanted the mix to sort of surround me a little bit more, this is a great trick for that. So let's check that out. So this is what I was talking about. We can solo and boost just the side frequencies. Let's go to a big passage here and do that. Cool, did you hear how there's basically no vocals in the sides, maybe just some effects, but no big deal, and those guitars are in the sides, and those guitars have such a sweet low mid-range that I wanted to warm up the mix with that low mid-range, and instead of just doing like, an EQ bell where I'm like adding low mid-range, by boosting the sides, which contain more low mid-range content, I can both widen the mix, feel like we're sort of surrounded, enveloped in that mix more, and add that warmth that low mid-range brings. So let's bypass and check it out.
If you don't wanna let me go, I won't step on your toes. Wanna take off your clothes. She's let her.
Did you hear how the guitars just got way more awesomer? I did. All right, next up we have Vertigo VSC2. This plugin rips. It's up there for my favorite in-the-box compressor, and that's because it does something that a lot of digital in-the-box compressors don't do. It has that rounded, like, transient response that I so love from like my old, DBX 160s from the 70s and stuff. Totally did that, but now I have it sort of in a plug-in form. I mean, this is a very different compressor than the DBX 160, but it does that rounded top transient thing well, and I love that stuff. All right, for settings, this will be pretty basic. For ratio, we're going 2:1, just like we did on the API. Again, when we're doing with mixed bus material, I usually don't go very high in my ratios. Attack is going to be slow in this case, very much unlike the API. The API from earlier did a great job with this fast attack tucking and rounding the snare in using the tone on loud and the fast attack. We got that done, so I don't have to do that anymore. So I'm taking a slower, more traditional mix bus gluing sort of mentality here, still letting the transients that I now like better through, but with a quick release so that the needle actually has some movement and doesn't just get stuck and do effectively nothing. And then lastly, we have a 90 Hz sidechain filter. This is gonna let my already pre-controlled kick drum, because we used FabFilter to make sure that was the case, it's gonna let all that low end through and not pump the compressor. So when I hit play here, you're gonna see the needles bouncing, but it's not a lot of gain reduction. Cool, right? We just get that like little bit of extra hold, that little bit of squish and glue. That compressor really does remind me of results that I can get in the analog domain. I really can't recommend it highly enough. It is sweet. Okay, so here's our lineup in sort of somewhat of an order. And before we apply limiting, I just want you guys to hear what all of these little tweaks did to the mix to turn it into a nicer thing for us to limit and master, or bring up to final volume is a better way to put that. So here they are in order: 1, 2, 3, 4. What was after soothe? 5, this catch is 5, 6, and then I believe it's 7, and then 8 here. Oh, they're numbered, so I should have seen that. So here we go. Before we make this super loud and crazy, let's see the difference. Here's before, and I'll just toggle this back off and on. That's a pretty wild difference, right? Like, it's very noticeable, and we didn't do much with any one thing. We did a little bit with a bunch of things. All right, so now we're gonna get into some limiting. I'm gonna use the modern setting on FabFilter Pro L4. If you can't tell, I love FabFilter. This is a great setting for, well, anything modern, and this most certainly is. It keeps the punch and the dynamics and the weight, and it doesn't get all smushy and weird, and that's what I kind of want this to do, and it did a great job of it. All right, so as advertised, here we go. We went with the modern preset here with a couple of tweaks. True peak limiting is on. That's really important so we don't get inner sample peaking. If you know what that is, that's a good Google for you. And we're gonna go up to 8x. I could probably go to 16. 8 always sounds fine to me. Again, hopefully your CPU is good enough to render this stuff. If it's not, you might have to make some concessions, but I can't say enough good things about how important it is to invest in your computer. And then, yeah, we got a 0.05 level here, or a negative 0.05. What does that do for us? That just makes sure that even though this is trying to do true peak limiting, in case it actually maybe misses 1 or 2, it should be caught because our maximum output level here is just a little bit below digital 0. So that's really cool. So watch this. If I reset my peak max and I hit play, we should end up just below 0. If you don't want to let me go, I won't step on your toes when I take off your clothes. You know, the reason we do that is just because occasionally you'll spit this into some sort of streaming service or whatever, and then they'll say, hey, we detect peaks, and then everyone gets all scared. Honestly, sonically, it's not a huge deal, but it's good practice to do it just so that you don't run into any weirds down the line. All right, that's that. We mastered the song. It rips. It came out today. I hope everybody enjoyed this video. Go enjoy the song. It's really goofy and fun. It's refreshing to have a song that doesn't really take itself too seriously. And yeah, see you next time. Broke her heart now, one thing's for sure. She don't like boys anymore.